Hello and welcome to Windows in Time, Robbie Collins, the man who saved Jacksonville, presented by Jackson County Library Services and the Southern Oregon Historical Society. I am Leah Pastizo, Digital Services Specialist. This program is being recorded. Please mute your microphones and turn off your camera to ensure quality recording. There will be a time to answer your questions at the end of the program. Jackson County Library Services acknowledges that its libraries are located within the traditional lands of the Shasta, Takelma, and Lakawa people, whose descendants are now identified as members of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, as well as of the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians and Modoc Nation, who were forced to relocate to Oklahoma. We take this moment to recognize the indigenous peoples whose traditional lands are where residents of Jackson County live today. JCLS is committed to fostering understanding, deep respect, and honor for indigenous people, and we encourage you to learn more about the land you reside on. For more information, go to jcls.org/land. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Jackson County Library Services. And now I'll hand it off.
Welcome on behalf of the Southern Oregon Historical Society and co-sponsor of these events. And I was reminded that this is the start of the 16th year of Windows in Time. Amazing. And wonderful that you could be here. If you are not a member of the Southern Oregon Historical Society, or if you would like to volunteer for one of the many kinds of activities, whether they be in the research library or collections or at Henley Farm, go to sohs.org. And there's both membership and volunteer information. So sohs.org. That's the political message for the day. Okay, today, we are so fortunate to have Larry Smith in this community. He's he's the unofficial town historian. I don't know, why aren't you the official?
I am the official.
Oh, then that's the town historian.
By the city council.
Grew up in Phoenix, attended both Southern Oregon College and Laterno College. Began working as a seasonal park ranger at Crater Lake when he was an infant, I think, because it's been so many years that you've worked there. And he and his brother have a book on Crater Lake, absolutely wonderful piece. Has taught field classes for both SOU and Antioch University, been a recipient of 4 national teaching awards, taught at Jacksonville Elementary School for many years. In 1989, the citizens of Jacksonville, alarmed by the potential of uncontrolled growth and development, founded the Jacksonville Woodlands Association, with Larry serving as president, executive director, and currently as development director. Okay. In the ensuing years, they have protected 21 wooded parcels measuring 320 acres and have constructed 12 miles of hiking and interpretive trails, and much of that done with children. It's just been a wonderful thing to watch. It is most likely the most successful citizen-based volunteer-driven conservation group in Oregon. How about in the country? So Larry is going to talk with us today about a transformation that took place in Jacksonville, and the man who spearheaded it, Robbie Collins. So kind of as Larry has spearheaded the more recent things that have brought Jacksonville to what it is today, Robbie Collins set the stage for the earlier development, and a very important one. So Larry.
Thank you so much, Alice. I feel rather honored having members of the Collins family here. Wow. John, would you raise your hand? cousin Barbara, would you raise your hand? And Bob over here, married to a Collins. Any other members of the Collins family here?
Jim Maddox.
Jim Maddox. Oh, I said John. I'm sorry. I meant
That's
yeah.
close.
Okay. But not the famous Maddox brothers and Rose, he told me. And also we have Carpenter family, Emily. Where's Emily? Okay, over here. I feel that's the important part of the family. I mean, the story here is the Carpenters, how they got involved in the preservation of Jacksonville also. So honored to have you here. On the back table, you will find some puzzles that are being given away by the Prairie Lake Institute. There's also other information there about the woodlands you may pick up, and also information about my book, which I'll be talking about in just a bit. Well, now, Robbie Collins was locally successful, nationally acclaimed, internationally renowned, and universally respected. That's really something for one person to be wrapped up. So I'm going to be sharing the story of how all this came together and how he founded the Boosters Club and spearheaded the establishment of the town's National Historic Landmark District. Now, he lived a life that circled the globe. I'll be talking about that, but he was firmly rooted in Jacksonville. And two other members of my family I'd like to mention. I got two grandkids here. David, who is just on the cusp of becoming a full-fledged teacher. So their license arrives in the mail. And then Logan over here, who is a member of the CAP and so on, 15 years old. And my wife, Linda, who keeps all this thing going. Okay. It all started when two mule packers discovered gold on Daisy Creek, sometimes known as Dairy Creek, and back in 1851. And within a few months, 3,000 expected miners had surrounded Rutsch Gulch, and Jacksonville was born. And gold jump-started the town's economic growth. It was gold that brought it forth. But soon a town was wrapped around the placer gold mines, and the town prospered for a time. But Jacksonville's sudden prosperity was to be short-lived, as the easy gold soon played out. And of course, you've heard Larry Mullaney talk about how the railroad came here. Jacksonville is the height of its prosperity, and the Southern Pacific missed Jacksonville by 5 miles. That's an important part of the story, because when Medford became established, that dominated the valley, and Jacksonville was sucked dry. So that great sucking sound you heard with businesses and everything moving to Medford. And the final nail in Jacksonville's economic coffin was the moving of the county seat to Medford in 1927. By this happening, Jacksonville lost its biggest source of revenue after being the county seat for 74 years. But the old 1883 courthouse is now our city hall. Have you had a chance to walk through it since it's been remodeled? The city put over $1 million into restoring it and stabilizing it. It's a beautiful building. But Jackson County finally gave it to the city after abandoning it twice. And several times a week, as spring approaches, I'll be taking kids through there. We talk about the government and so on. So it's a great place for teaching kids about early life here in Jacksonville. But you know, the Great Depression had no real effect on Jacksonville. Do you know that? Because by 1920s, everything had shut down. There was nothing to close in Jacksonville. And so it just kind of slumbered. The town went into a 50-year slumber, frozen in time, from 1910 to about 1960. And it was poverty that preserved Jacksonville. There was no money to fix things up. The town waited 50 years for the arrival of Robbie Collins. And one of his favorite things, Barbara, was he'd say to me, with poverty comes preservation. And that seemed to be really true, because with the poverty, you couldn't tear things down, the town just sat. Now, thanks to Robbie Collins, this is what the town looks like today. So he was born in 1921 and passed away in 2003. And I remember another thing that he often said was, it does not matter who gets the credit, as long as the work gets done. So I'd like to thank the people who helped put this program together. Marshall Lango, a good friend in Jacksonville, and he was a Collins friend, worked for Robbie for a number of years. My brother, Lloyd, my twin brother, who did a lot of photo scanning. Carolyn Kingsnorth, what a resource. You need to know anything about Jacksonville, you go find Carolyn with Historic Jacksonville. And Barbara, 50% of my material came from Barbara. The other half came from Robbie. So if I'm wrong on anything, it's because of what the stories that Robbie gave me. George Kramer, who is historical consultant, the City of Jacksonville planner, Ian Foster. And of course, the Southern Oregon Historical Society was a great source of finding pictures. Ben Truey, another one I can answer about any question you want to know about history. And Mike McLean from the Jacksonville Boosters Club archives helped me put this thing together. So Robbie was born in 1921 in Riverside, California. This picture is probably when he was about age 4. Got a blue thing showing up here. I don't know what that is. Barbara wrote this on an email. I thought it was great. One of my favorites, and one which I believe is representative of Robbie's whole life. He always had a wide circle of good friends from every walk of life, race, ethnicity, and from an early age, this started. And he looks to be about 2.5, 3 years of age here. You know, one of the really interesting things that the father and mother required the kids to do was each month the Collins kids would have to select some of their toys and clothing, get in the family car, and go bless other families in need, regardless of their color or their social standing. He was quite athletic early on, too. So here are the 4 Collins siblings. Barbara is related to Ed, who is sitting down. Now, Jim,
My mother is in the middle, I think.
right in the middle. Okay, to be Charlotte?
Yeah.
Okay. Isn't that great having representatives here with the family? Thank you, Barbara, for these pictures.
Yes.
And here's our family as they started growing up. Yes.
Can you go back to that picture for a second? Can you say where?
My mother's in the middle in the back.
Okay,
Okay, right behind Ed.
Yeah.
thank you very much.
So Robbie graduated from Stanford University. Was that in business, you know?
You know, I'm not,
I had somebody ask me that last week.
he was always interested in history, I know, but
Okay.
I'm not sure if it was a business degree or not.
So he followed service in World War II and worked for a year in San Francisco before
okay.
finally moving to Jackson County in 1948 to join the rest of his family that moved here. Yes.
We have people, so we have people online joining us,
Okay.
and so if you're pointing to people in the audience, can we mic them so
Okay.
people online can hear them? Okay,
All right.
so what you said before you asked this person a question?
Yeah, I said,
You would ask whether Robbie had a business degree
Yeah.
from Stanford, and I'm not quite sure, to tell you the truth. I think I could find that out, but I know he was also interested in history and architecture, and but that's a good question.
okay. And he joined his brother Ed here in a lumber remanufacturing business in 1948, turning wood from local sawmills into specialty wood products. According to Robbie, they were just trying to make a living, but Carolyn Kingsnor said, looking back, however, we recognize that they were also in the conservation business, taking used material and turning it into other wood products. Now, I ran across this word dunnage, weird thing. And they started reworking dunnage into these products. What in the world is dunnage? My brother then started going through some of Tucker Snowcat pictures and archives. The Tucker Snowcat Corporation, over snow vehicle, is right here, invented here in Medford. My dad worked with them for many years. He found this picture of my father using dunnage. This is what dunnage is. It's scrap wood that you take into a boxcar and you use it as a spacer in between things so you could ship stuff. That's how they were using this lumber, among other things. And then he started making mop handles and broomsticks and so on out of this stuff. But can you imagine 50 years ago, this picture was taken of my own father using dunnage. So the brothers divided up the business into different parts. Robbie handled the loading service, and his brother Ed took care of the Mount Pitt Company. And they worked together, and this is some of their letterheads. And so Robbie retired from dunnage business in 1984. But it was back in 1964 that it was a major turning point for Jacksonville. A destructive highway bypass was being proposed. This is the dreaded one. There it is right there. It goes from where Ray's Market sits today over to the maintenance area and the Brit parking lots. And but just behind the post office. So they cut right through town. It would have wiped out 12 houses and divided up 6 neighborhoods had this highway been built. But during this potentially destructive drama, Robbie bought the Kaler Law Office building on North 3rd Street in 1962 and moved into it to make it his new home. That little tiny, Robbie was never fancy. He loved very simply. So he moved in this little tiny historic building. The same week, he told me, his new friend, Eugene Bennett, moved into the historic Eagle Brewery on South Oregon Street, which is just below Britt. And for years, I talked to Robbie about this, and Robbie would say, you know, the night I moved into that Kaler Law Office, I had a dinner party. He always used the word dinner party. And then he'd say, but Gene took weeks to get settled before he could invite people in. Well, I happened to be in Robbie's house one day, giving a talk about Robbie after he passed away. And Eugene was standing there and he heard the talk. He said, dinner party. Robbie served hot dogs and Eskimo pies that night, and his guests sat on packing boxes. But for some reason, Robbie liked to use that word dinner party. He served as the first Boosters Club president from 1963 to 1968 after he got it founded. And this is one of the quotes from him. There are no dues, no assessments, but hard work will make you a member. What are our dues now, hon? About $70, I think. The purpose of this organization, as Robbie wrote it, shall be the work for the general welfare and improvement of the city of Jacksonville. That was in 1963. Now, in 2022, they say we engage the community by preserving Jacksonville's history and enhancing its livability. So back to the story of the bypass. So again, from Ray's Market over to the Brit parking lot. This is where Robbie's house at. See it right there? So Robbie told me, he said, I wasn't so interested in historic preservation back then. He said, I just didn't want a freeway that close to my house. But by opposing Glenn Jackson, the all-powerful Oregon State Highway Commissioner, Robbie changed Jacksonville's history. Because Jackson got what he wanted. If it destroyed a town, the cars had priority. So he marshaled his friends in high places. Robbie always knew people at the top of everything. And they fought the bypass for several years. When I moved there and started teaching in 66, the fight was still going on. But it was finally defeated. And Glenn Jackson showed up at a meeting where Robbie was a couple of years later. And he didn't take defeat easily. And Robbie said he walked up to him and said, now that you've saved that blankety blank town, what are you going to do with it? Robbie said, that got him thinking. What am I going to do with this town? I caught it. Now I have to do something with it. Well, what's sitting across the street from him? The old U.S. Hotel, slated for destruction. They were going to be tearing it down. It was sitting empty and abandoned. It had been built in 1880. It was for the former pride of Jacksonville. Even President Rutherford B. Hayes stayed there. And it served as a hotel, a bar, and finally as a museum. And then finally it was abandoned. And it was sitting abandoned when Robbie moved into the Kaler Law Office. So he talked to Curly Graham, the mayor, and said, why don't you and us go on up to Portland, talk to the president of the U.S. Bank. Now, go to the president of the bank, not some lowly down here, go up Portland. So they went up there and talked to the president of U.S. Bank and said, hey, U.S. Hotel, U.S. Bank, wouldn't that be a nice combination? And he talked him into it. And the long-awaited hotel was destined to be torn down. And so you can see the condition it was in. And so Robbie came up with $25,000 from Alfred Carpenter. They went to him and asked him, the Carpenter Foundation was not in existence yet when this happened. It was private money. And then they had the U.S. Hotel. Robbie came with this great idea. Why don't you pay your rent ahead? So he picked up $25,000 from U.S. Hotel, so they got to be there rent-free for quite a number of years. And that started the preservation program in Jacksonville. This is where it started, right here. And supposedly, I've heard 25,000 people showed up at the bank's dedication. But here's the connection. Charlotte Collins, let's see, that'd be your grandmother, and Helen Carpenter were friends back in Iowa together. And that's how how Robbie worked. Okay, you know somebody, let's go use that connection. And like Barbara said, he had these wonderful connections. And that's how he was able to get the $25,000 out of Alfred Carpenter. And Alfred Carpenter's lawyer, George Rasmussen, said, you know, you probably won't get that money back. And Alfred responded, I know that, but I want to do it. And so that was the start of everything. So thank you, Carpenter family, for getting the preservation started here in over there in Jacksonville. So 4 years after becoming a National Historic Landmark city, Jacksonville became a movie set. They turned it back into looking like an 1880 town with mud streets, wooden sidewalks, and so forth. And here comes Robert Duvall riding down the street. I took that picture of him. And then the picture of Cliff Robertson as Cole Younger. And the whole town became a movie set. It was raining when they were making the movie. And so when it quit raining, they had to make it keep raining. So they kicked fire hoses out there. And those are great actors, Duvall and Youngkin was, Robertson was in that picture there, getting wet and soaked down. And can you imagine? It looks just like it did. That's 1970. It looks like 1870. This is what it looks like today. One of my former exchange students picture, that was on the front page of the newspaper. That's Seiichi. He now owns 5 restaurants in Japan named Jacksonville Hamburger. Now, looking across the street, you can see the newly refurbished U.S. Hotel. And after 57 years, the U.S. Bank decided to pull out of Jacksonville. And the bank is now, the building is sitting empty again. But, have you heard the news? Brit bought it.
Yeah.
And so Brit is going to, over the next 4 years, they said, trying to create administrative offices, a store, a box office, and hopefully a performance center up in the ballroom. So there's going to be new life breathed back into Robbie's legacy. He helped write the National Historic Landmark application for Jacksonville. It was one of the first 8 to ever get through Congress. In fact, he rushed it too fast. It didn't even go through the state the SHPO. It went directly to Congress. That's how the way Robbie operated. And that happened the year I started teaching at Jacksonville. Have you been to the Big Ben Bank right here? You'll see the plaque. And it's really interesting. That plaque is only 50 feet from Robbie's first house. And it's a National Registered Landmark. This site possesses exceptional value in commemorating the history of the United States. Then the next fight came. The U.S. Post Office decided to build a new post office in Jacksonville. It was going to be a cement block building right on Oregon Street. And Robbie hollered out, no, you're not going to do that. So he went to the postmaster. He gathered up a lot of people and finally got them to do something decent. And he got Jeff Shute, who happened to be a neighbor of ours, designed it and came up with our present. This is another one. Most people don't know that. This is another one of Robbie's legacies. We would have just a cement building sitting there if it hadn't been for Robbie gathering of people. He went to the senators. He went to the postmaster general to make this thing happen. He wasn't going to just let a cement box get built in Jacksonville. So following his success in 1966, he started being asked, why didn't you come and talk to our town? So Robbie told me the next town he talked at was Albany. And they set up their historic district. And then he started being asked to serve on boards, Oregon Shakespearean Festival, the Portland Museum. The University of Oregon gave him a Distinguished Citizens Award. He was on the board for Southern Oregon Historical Society. And the world really started taking notice of Robbie Collins and his talent. And Barbara again writes, he developed a large social network of wonderful collaborative friends. Robbie had this gift of being able to talk to anybody about anything. I thought it was wonderful. He was sincerely interested in other people and their lives. He was passionate about community projects, and he liked to help get things done and make it as fun as possible. And that was one word I heard Robbie use over and over and over again. Wouldn't that be fun? Being single, he also had the luxury and gift of being able to travel, explore, and work in many places, always building new bridges and developing new friendships that lasted forever. Barbara Hireman. Thank you, Barbara. And then he went to work for other organizations like PATA, using his expertise mostly in Europe, in Asia. But then during this time, he moved in from the Kaler Law Office into a more permanent building at the PJ Ryan dwelling house over on just up the street from where he was living. And it was his home for the next 40 years. Now, coming in, somebody said, "You'll be talking about Ginger Rogers?" I said, "You bet I am." Here's a picture signed by her to Robbie, standing outside of his house, the house, which is now South Stage Cellars. And for a while, Robbie was her manager even. And here's four pictures of Ginger at Robbie's house there at the Ryan dwelling house, having one of his famous dinner parties. Have you walked into that building? It was just bare bones, more like a warehouse. He had friends like Terry O'Flannery, TV credit from the San Francisco Chronicle. Eric Allen was a good friend of his, who was the longtime editor of the Mail Tribune. And the one thing that Robbie did, he'd have these sherry parties. He would bring the important people out to Jacksonville. This before it became a National Historic Landmark, or right as it was happening, and hold sherry parties in the Kaler Law Office. And he'd show off Jacksonville's potential. And here he is standing outside with people from Shakespeare, from the Oregon SHPO office. And he introduced Nixon to Ginger Rogers. This guy, he operated at just a different level than most people. And here's a whole list of people that he met and talked to, like James Beard, which I'll be talking about more. He even met Pope Pius, Senator Mark Hatfield, Thor Underdahl. Linda and I have been in his hotel, his museum back in Oslo, and so forth. Sir Edmund Hillary, he met. I wonder if he ever met his twin.
Jack Benny.
Now, my grandkids don't have any idea who Jack Benny is. Isn't it amazing? Served on the board for the Thousand Friends of Oregon. 11 years on National Trust for Historic Preservation. Founded the Robertson E. Collins Foundation. I guess you operate that, don't you?
We actually founded it in his memory.
Oh, okay.
After he died.
And he wrote several books. A Disorderly Excursion. That was his life. Disorderly. Life is a deliciously disorderly excursion. Isn't that something that he would write that? Now, here are all the properties that he owned in Jacksonville: the Kaler Law Office, the Ryan Dwelling House, the Milo Caton House, the Ben Drew Warehouse, the Beacon Express lot, the Catholic Rectory, and the RRVRR Monument, which was 2 by 2 feet. So his first building was the Kaler Law Office. It's now the home to Trotting Fox. This is the PJ Dwelling House that he owned for 40 years. The Milo Caton House next door, which he got from his sister. The Ben Drew Warehouse. I asked him, I said, "What are you going to do with this thing?" It's just sitting there. He said, "It's for my junk." What he called it, his junk. He opened up a private museum. He'd hire neighbor kids to come in. This is Nick Lango. If you ever go out to Best Buy, he's the general manager of the Best Buy now. And he got to start running this little museum for Robbie. And Robbie would pay the kids to come in and keep it open certain hours during the day. And the Cottage Kitchen lot, which is now the Beacon Express. The Catholic Rectory, he bought that to save it. Gave it to Jackson County, which gave it to the Friends of St. Joseph's, who gave it back to county, who gave it to the city of Jacksonville. Understand, the city of Jacksonville now owns it. And then the most interesting thing that he owned for a while to try to preserve it was this little piece right here. It's 2 feet by 2 feet. They're actually the deed on that thing. And that's where the RRVRR marker is today. Now, a few stories about Robbie Collins. because he was soon traveling the world, advocating the preservation. What he said, what he told me was, he'd go to these governments, he'd go to the top people and say, you know, if you preserve this, you'll get people, don't tear it down. You get people to come and look at it, and that ups your economic level by people coming to visit it. So that's what he was using as a come on. So during the first 2 weeks of school, every year for years, my kids had an assignment. I was teaching 5th grade. They had to write a letter to Robbie Collins. I gave them an outline of what was to be included in the letter, and then they sit down and write this 5-part letter to Robbie. And then we send them off to where he was, wherever in the world. This happened to be Josh Offord. I don't know if some of you know him, one of my students. And then in turn, wherever Robbie was at, he'd mail us letters back. And he would send us, you know, back in those days, every time you go to a different country, you had to have different money. So he would have all these pockets full of change and so on. He just throw them in an envelope and mail them to us. Put an X on it. That was his signature, an X. And he sent stamps to us. One time, a big box showed up. There was a stuffed dragon inside of it. He found somewhere in the world and saw it and mailed it to us. We got a lot of Chinese funeral money too. He was always sending that over. One day we got this letter from him. He said, I've had breakfast in the Azores, lunch in Lisbon, and dinner in Madrid. And David Collins, who would be your brother, said his uncle was like a third parent to him and his sisters as they were growing up. In addition to sophisticated trips to San Francisco that would include the theater, museums, and elegant restaurants, Robbie had other traditions for his nephew and his 2 nieces, said David. Christmas gifts from Uncle Robbie were always a surprise. One year he gave them a waste paper-sized jar of peanut butter. Another year at Christmas time, he walked into the house with a goat behind him. Another Christmas, they were opening up all their presents and found out it was their own clothes. He just had a real sense of humor. And he would often, I'd look in the back window of my room, my schoolroom, and there would be Robbie waving at me. I say, Robbie, come on in, come on in. He'd just show up unannounced. Back then, you could do that in a classroom. He'd come in, and I'd bring up to the front of the room. I'd say, kids, this is the father of Jacksonville here. And he'd go, oh, pasha, pasha, pasha. And then we sit down for the next hour and put him on a stool just like this. And then we quiz him and talk to him. And he'd share about how he found it, did all the things in his travels and so forth. It was great having him in front of the class. During our fundraisers, of course, I'd have the kids write him a letter. And then I'd get a letter back with, of course, a check in it. He'd say, Larry, you play dirty. Come spring, Robbie would send us money, and we'd buy trees with it. And we'd go out and plant trees. And the one thing he said, just don't talk about it. He just wanted it quiet. So we'd go out and plant trees that Robbie bought. At the end of school, he'd invite us over to his house. And he'd put on one of his dinner parties for us. It was Hawaiian punch and Oreo cookies. He kept things simple, but it was really great. The great man would invite us to come over to his house. And after he moved more or less permanently to Singapore, he sent a $20 bill would show up in the mail. He said, go down to the market and buy Oreo cookies and punch. He said, and go to Mr. Lango and get the key and come into my house. And so we'd have our party there without him. We had to make sure we didn't leave any Oreo cookie crumbs behind. But of course, this is a home for South Stage Sellers now. One day he came to me and he said, you know, Larry, this thing with the Woodlands Association, you've got to write this thing down. And you keep track of it. And I said, Robbie, I always remember this stuff. He said, no, you got to start writing it down. So I did. I started writing it down. Pretty soon I had 15 boxes of notes and photographs and so on and articles. And I ended up writing the book. So this is because of Robbie. Got me involved in writing that thing. Jacksonville's Emerald Necklace, the most successful small town, all volunteer conservation trail project in Oregon, 2.2 pounds. So in 2000, Linda and I headed for Southeast Asia. And we sailed in Singapore on the R2 ship. And I'd alerted Robbie we were coming, and there he was on the port waiting for us. And he'd moved there in 1986. And he started introducing us to his many friends right away. We'd walk down the street, Mr. Collins, Mr. Collins. We were in downtown Singapore. People knew who he was. And he took us to the famous historic Raffles Hotel. He said after we saved it, he was on that committee, he said it got so expensive I couldn't afford to stay there anymore. But we had lunch there. And then S.T. Lee, a renowned plastic surgeon in the very center. By the way, this recording is going to go to him in Singapore. And Dr. Lee contacted me. He said, I want to buy a bench in the honor of Robbie. And so if you got along one of our trails, a friend of Jacksonville, and this is what he wanted to put on, S.T. Lee, Singapore. And this is off his webpage. Robbie took us to Singapore's famous botanical gardens. And finally, without explaining what we were doing, he put us on the metro. And yes, we can't have gum on the metro. It goes over, they stick it over cameras and they make a mess and so on. And he took us to Indiatown first. And he said, look, we saved the buildings. But there's nobody here. And then without saying anything, we went over to Arab Town. He said, look, we saved the buildings. I couldn't understand what he was getting at. He said, but there's nobody here. Then he took us to Chinatown. I felt like we were in the Ghost of Christmas Past. He said, look, we saved the buildings, but there's nobody here. And then he made this really prophetic statement. You can save the buildings, but you cannot save the culture. Here he is in historic preservation, but you can't save the culture, but you can save buildings. He then took us to Orchard Road, which is the very downtown main street in Singapore. This is where you're going to find today's culture. You can't save the culture out there, but you can save the buildings, but the culture moves according to the way people are living. That was quite a lesson. Now, his long-term dream was to rebuild an 1854 Beekman Express Brooks drugstore. And this is where C.C. Beekman started his express and banking business. And so contacting his good friend Marshall Lango, they started working on the drawing. It took almost 20 years till they could count every board, almost counted every nail. But Robbie's building had quite a story to, the building lot had quite a story to it. It was used as a garden spot pretty much after the original building was torn down. And then an old circus wagon was moved in and parked up against the Ben Drew warehouse. And it became kind of Jacksonville's living room. And it was a gathering spot for very special occasions. They even had a Ferris wheel there. This is right next to Robbie's house. And remember Snyder's Dairy? My dad used to work for Snyder's Dairy. And this is the corner we're talking about. But eventually the sitting area was built around the old circus wagon, and it became known as a cottage kitchen. And Mary was the owner of it, and she wouldn't turn anybody away. I had people that used to eat there years ago, and she said if they couldn't pay for a meal, everybody could come into Mary and get something to eat. And then they lived, Mary and her husband lived upstairs in the Ben Drew warehouse. But one day, James Beard shows up. Robbie gets word he's coming to visit him. Here's a top cooker in the nation. What am I going to do? So Robbie said he ran over to Aunt Mary's kitchen and said, I need some meatloaf sandwiches. So she whipped them up. Robbie hastily threw together a salad by opening up cans, served his aunt's fudge for dessert. And after eating the meal, James asked, could I go meet the pot roast cook? So Robbie took him over next door and he said, I want to meet the lady. I learned something from her. I learned something from every cook I meet. These are the people who know American cooking. They know the shortcuts. They know how to improve things. They know how to make it simple. They know how to make it economical. And that is Mr. Beard talking about Aunt Mary next door in his little circus wagon. And then Robbie goes on and writes about this. He was a fun man. You see that word showing up again? He had no pretense. He was a celebrity. He was used to a high life in New York. He had a PR agent. He was warm, easygoing, loved Jacksonville, enthusiastic and responsive. So eventually Collins bought the lot. And then Robbie told me the health department came and inspected Aunt Mary's kitchen. and said, "You're shutting this thing down." And Robbie Collins says, "Oh, no, you're not." And he told me he went to the health department and said, "Give her one more year, please. And then she'll retire her circus wagon and her little seating area." And the health department, because of Robbie's advocation, said, "Okay." And so they let her stay there for another year. And finally, Robbie tore it down. And it started being used for, again, it went back to Jacksonville's living room. And this happened to be Dave Jenkins, my principal at Jacksonville School. We're having a tree lighting ceremony there. And then Robbie wanted to do something with it. He wanted to rebuild that building. So he and Marshall Lango prepared plans. And because an empty lot looks like a missing tooth. And he had to get special permission from the National Park Service to rebuild an exact replica. Park Service owned the facade to it. We were not. And you cannot reproduce without getting permission. And so he went through a lot of process. He got permission to rebuild it exactly like it was. Jacksonville's official Christmas tree grew there on Robbie's lot. He wanted to save it, but he said it was so full of bugs and beetles, they had to cut the thing down. And so they started building it. And as it came up, I went to the builder and I said, "What is the architectural form of this thing? What is the style?" He said, "It's Midwestern feed store." And there's the building. And finally, Robbie's lamp legacy. You've probably noticed the ancient original light that's hanging on the corner of the McCulley building, which is the IOF building. Have you all seen that? It's the last original gas light still in Jacksonville. So Robbie took pictures of it, got a designer. He said he told me he spent $3,000 coming up with a replica model for it. And then he donated the design to the city of Jacksonville. This is Robbie's gaslight legacy. It's even used as the logo for the Boosters Club that he founded. Now, by the spring of 2003, after 20 years of planning and building, Robbie's dream of rebuilding Beekman's Express was almost complete. He had told me, and he was telling other people, as soon as that lamp gets lit outside of the Beekman Express building, he'd consider the project finally complete. So it was on May 23rd of 2003, the city crews, including DeAndrea's father, my son-in-law, Richard, completed the electrical hookup and the light came on. Then word came from Singapore that Robbie had passed away from dengue fever just as his lamp light was being lit on the very eve of the building's completion. Rest in peace, Robbie Collins. Your legacy lives on. Thank you very much.